The Gardiner Expressway is one of the most controversial pieces of infrastructure in Toronto. Almost nobody likes it as it is, but nobody can agree about what to do about it. The Gardiner was named after the very first chairman of Metropolitan Toronto. Now, that probably won't mean anything to people under 30. But for about 45 years, the GTA had another level of government in between the cities and the province. And this led to endless debates about who should control what and who should be making decisions. This week, we'll be talking about the birth of Metro Toronto and Frederick Big Daddy Gardiner, the man who built Metro into a major player. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller.
This is Muddy York. So, Gray, did you ever wonder who the Gardiner was named for?
You know, I cursed the name a lot, but I never actually put too much thought into it. So, no.
In fairness, quite a few people cursed his name when he was still alive, so I suppose you're keeping the tradition going. But, like I mentioned, the Gardiner is named after someone who was incredibly influential, even though he didn't actually hold an elected position while he played a huge role in how Toronto developed. This is going to be an episode about urban development and Jane Jacobs stuff and how the city evolved and a lot of decisions, some good and some bad. But let's get to the man himself. So, Frederick Gardiner was born in 1895, and he grew up near Dundas and Euclid, just east of Trinity Bellwood. His father was an Irish immigrant who had a bit of an interesting career. He spent 8 years working as an attendant at an insane asylum before becoming a guard at Toronto Central Prison, where he would retire as deputy warden. He used his salary from these jobs to pay for his side business, which was buying buildings in his neighborhood, renovating them himself, and then renting them out to tenants. By 1900, he owned 8 different properties. Despite this relative prosperity, young Frederick remembered scrimping, saving, and mending our own socks. His father also expected him to spend most of the summer and many of his weekends helping him to renovate one of his properties. While managing construction projects many years later, Gardiner would surprise his colleagues with his knowledge of building techniques that he learned from his father.
Gardiner initially struggled at school and actually had to repeat the 4th grade. His sister said that he was the rough and tough type, forever getting into hot water and putting sports ahead of his studies. However, something changed in high school. Gardiner said it was a rivalry with the others, taking over as much as anything. All of a sudden, I felt what it could be like to outdo them, to be out front of the crowd. He would finish second in his class, and that obsessive competitiveness would become one of his defining characteristics. He moved on to U of T, where he completed 3 years before enlisting to fight in World War I. Despite his 2.5 years in uniform, the war didn't have a major impact on him, probably because he joined the Royal Flying Corps and never fought in the trenches. However, he did pick up a pair of vices during his time overseas: gambling and whiskey. Upon his return to Toronto, he decided to enroll at Osgoode Hall Law School, using his poker winnings to pay for tuition. Special accommodations for returning veterans allowed Gardiner to complete the normally 3-year program in just over 1. He would finish first in his class, winning a $400 cash prize, among other things. He used the money to buy an engagement ring for Audrey Seaman, the daughter of a flooring company owner. Her most important trait was that probably she was tough enough not to be pushed around by her strong-willed husband. Over the next 25 years, Gardiner became one of the preeminent trial lawyers in Ontario. He was known for his systematic presentation of evidence based on exhaustive research, as well as his dramatic courtroom speeches, all delivered in his deep Irish voice.
We'll actually be playing a recording of Gardiner's voice later, but for those of you imagining he had one of those deep Irish brogues, with the heavy accent and that gravelly tone that they used to have.
His professional successes was reflected in the growing fees that he was able to charge. By the mid-30s, Gardiner had a house in Forest Hill, a cottage on Lake Simcoe, a full-time maid, 2 cars back when that was a real luxury, with enough left over to send his 2 kids to private school. He also began to indulge in higher stakes gambling. He once admitted to losing $6,000 in one night, the modern equivalent of $125,000. This guy seemed to be a baller. Under pressure from his wife, he agreed to scale back the betting and tried to shift his attention to new areas by taking up gardening of all things. Gardening, okay.
The Gardiner's gardener, I guess?
In 1936, he decided to go into local politics, essentially on a dare. He had been holding forth about the lessons of a recent federal election, when a friend said that if he knew so much about politics, why not be a candidate himself? Then, as now, Forest Hill was a wealthy bedroom community. Unlike today, it was a separate village, northwest of Toronto, with less than 10,000 residents. Gardiner was elected as deputy reeve. A reeve is roughly equivalent to a mayor. He received lots of support from local politicians and businessmen that he'd represented in court. It also helped that he spent $800 on his campaign, which was an incredible sum in those days. He quickly became the dominant voice on council, and a year later he was acclaimed as the new reeve of Forest Hill. He usually got his way during council meetings. One of the councilors said, he knew more about the facts than any of us did. He had always taken the time to check things out thoroughly and have the options spelled out. So how could you combat the man? In his 12 years as reeve, Gardiner would only be on the losing side of a council vote 4 times. Unfortunately, one of his uglier moments happened during this period, when Japanese Canadian women were banned from entering Forest Hill to work as domestics. Gardiner justified this decision by declaring that Japanese spread like leprosy. I have no objection to admitting the women, except for the fact that we have no power to send them back after the war. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there.
At this point, we're going to pause Gardiner's story to talk about the evolution of Toronto's boundaries. If you're the kind of person who thinks this sounds interesting, Muddy York is the podcast for you. I told you guys, this is where it's at. When the city was first created in 1834, it only covered the area from Bathurst to Parliament and from Dundas to the lake. As the population grew, Toronto would expand by taking over neighboring villages like Parkdale and Yorkville. By 1912, it roughly matched the boundaries of the old city of Toronto. But from then on, City Council decided that further expansion would be too expensive. Of course, the population didn't stop growing and urban neighborhoods began to show up in neighborhood suburbs. The problem was that most of these suburbs didn't have the money to build the infrastructure needed to support this kind of neighborhood. Things like water and sewage system. Townships like North York, Etobicoke, and Scarborough were mostly rural, and the farmers in these areas had no interest in paying higher taxes to build infrastructure for these new urban communities. These problems contributed to a housing crisis after World War II, not unlike today, and this led to talk about the need to redraw municipal boundaries in the Toronto area.
During his time as reeve, Gardiner had supported plenty of planning board projects that never went anywhere because of local opposition. And by 1950, he was advocating for the amalgamation of the different communities around Toronto. Only the provincial government had the power to do that. Luckily for Gardiner, he was a longtime ally and trusted advisor to the premier of the day, a man named Leslie Frost. Gardiner had actually been best friends with Frost's older brother, so they had a long-time relationship going back 20 years. However, the government caucus warned that amalgamation would, quote, pile up such a cloud of grudge votes against us that we will be snowed under at the next election. People who remember the fight over amalgamation in 1998 will know that that statement was basically correct. So Frost settled on a compromise plan. A new level of government would be created, the Metropolitan Toronto Council. Half of the council would come from Toronto, and the other half from the neighboring communities. There were no direct elections at this time. Council members would be mayors and other elected officials from the existing municipalities. Metro would have authority over regional issues, including highways, subways, parks, water, and sewage. The old municipalities would continue to exist, and and they would exercise power over things like public health, police, and fire protection, although some of these powers would be shifted to Metro in the years ahead. Metro Council would be led by a chairman, initially appointed by the province and then elected by council members. I'm sure you can guess who Frost chose for the job. Gardiner was ideal, an old friend that he could trust and an experienced politician with plenty of knowledge about municipal issues in the GTA.
In April 1953, Gardiner was sworn in as Metro Council chairman and promptly threw himself into the job, working 10 to 12-hour days and more than a few weekends. He later wrote, "When I was sick, I dreamed in Technicolor that I had died and I was dickering over the terms of final place of residence. I got bold, knocked on the pearly gates, and asked if I could come in. St. Peter thought it over and finally said I was welcome in heaven, but on one condition, that I had to metropolitanize it." One of the reasons that he had to work so much was because nobody knew what a Metro chairman was supposed to do. His only official power was to break a tie in council, so one of Gardiner's first acts was to create an executive committee, naturally led by him, with the power to appoint senior officials, preparing spending estimates, initiate all contracts, and do anything else that council might refer to it. Gardiner used these powers to make himself the head of the Metro government instead of just leading Metro Council. As one councillor said, Gardiner, quote, has a habit of taking unto himself more duties than are attached to his office. Around this time, he acquired the nickname of Big Daddy, a reference to Cat on a Hot Tin Roof by Tennessee Williams. He preferred to be known as the Super Mayor, and one of the more creative titles came from a Toronto Star cartoonist who called him the Maharaja of Metrostan.
Even when he couldn't take personal control of an issue, he had ways of getting council to do what he wanted. He used his power as the presiding officer to control council meetings. He would quickly run through agenda items. In at least one case, he neglected to ask if there were any votes in opposition. He would also take advantage of his comprehensive knowledge about issues. At this time, most councillors were part-time politicians and didn't have time to study most of the issues under debate. Gardiner would go around the table, rebutting objections to his plans one by one. When all else failed, Nathan Phillips described his final tactic. When he really wanted something, he just came and beat it out of you.
I hope he didn't mean that literally.
Probably not, although Gardiner was a big guy. But he was willing to berate you for as long as it took. If he was determined to pass something, he was perfectly willing to extend meetings for hours until the opposition gave in. They usually did. Somebody wrote that the Metro system was, quote, kept functioning by the determination and at times the despotism of one man.
Big Daddy. So, what was Gardiner planning to do with the Metro system? The short answer is that he wanted to build. Gardiner was firmly pro-growth and frequently said that he wanted to put shovels in the ground. The first project that Metro undertook under his leadership was the construction of the so-called Lakeshore Expressway. I'm sure you can figure out what we call it today. Gardiner didn't create this idea. It had been kicking around for over a decade, but he was the one who put shovels in the ground. For all the modern complaints about the Gardiner, there was little opposition to its construction. Highways were seen as the way of the future, and Jen Jacobs was just an editor with Architectural Forum. The biggest controversy at the time was that the proposed route of the expressway went right through Fort York. Regular listeners will already know this story because we covered it in our most recent episode about Fort York. Gardiner wanted to relocate the entire fort to the lakeshore, brick by brick, but public opposition eventually forced him to alter the route. It was one of the few political battles that he lost. The Don Valley Parkway is another plan that had been kicking around for years. Torontonians had voted to approve the construction of a freeway through the Don Valley, but the plan had been blocked by opposition from East York. As far as Gardiner was concerned, Metro had been created to stop this kind of NIMBYism. He laid out his plans on a walk through the valley. We'll move the railway over a piece, we'll tear down the hill, we'll ship the river over a piece, then we can have the highway through there. He used similar methods to get approval from council. When consulting engineers wanted to consider an alternative route, he insisted that the project had to begin immediately, or the whole of the east end of the city will be on our shoulders like 3 tons of bricks. When councilors offered objections, he argued that we can't very well back out now, and we can't let the clock stand still and do nothing. Using this approach, the Don Valley Parkway went from proposal to policy in a little more than 2 years.
These years, it would take that long just to fill out the forms. Gardiner is often thought of as a man who wanted to redesign Toronto around the automobile. But during his time as Metro chairman, he became increasingly committed to the cause of expanding public transit. At one point, he declared that the irresistible fact is that you simply cannot provide sufficient highways and parking space to accommodate every person who desires to drive his motor vehicle downtown and back every day. I was going for Irish there. I think I got New York.
I don't know if it was either of those, to be honest. But okay.
Until then, TTC had been a largely independent organization that operated on a pay-as-you-go model, based almost entirely on fares. Under Gardiner, Metro created an annual subsidy for TTC, and he lobbied the province to contribute money as well. In 1958, Metro voted to spend $102 million to build a second subway line in Toronto, what we know as the Bloor-Danforth line. TTC ridership would decline during and after Gardiner's time in government, but noticeably less than it did in the United States. The other area where Metro would make a big difference under Gardiner's leadership was housing. As we mentioned, Toronto had a major housing shortage after World War II, and Gardiner said that one of his goals was to continue the tradition of home ownership, which has made this country one of the most stable and law-abiding anywhere. Gardiner mostly supported private construction of new housing. He wanted Metro to provide the roads, water, and sewer systems to support developers. At the same time, he supported an NDP proposal to impose a capital gains tax on land speculators, so he wasn't always a friend of business. Housing construction more than doubled during Gardiner's time at Metro, but it would also create problems for the future. Much of this construction was low-density detached housing that restricted future development and made mass transit difficult to operate. But again, this was the 50s, and millions of Canadians, like my grandparents, dreamed of owning their own home in the suburbs.
Gardiner supported some public housing, most notably at Lawrence Heights, where he fought the local opposition, proclaiming at one public meeting, "There is no room for bamboo or iron curtains in this country. They," the occupants of public housing, "do not want to be isolated as if they were infidels." The Lawrence Heights project went ahead despite this opposition, which brings us to what would become the biggest criticism of the Metro chairman. He wasn't chosen by voters. Gardiner was initially appointed by the province, and after 1955, he was elected by council. Voters never got a chance to register their opinion. Gardiner saw this as a good thing. In his mind, Metro was supposed to stand above the petty politics of the municipalities so it could pursue the kind of large-scale projects that inevitably ruffled local sensibilities. He might have pointed to Lawrence Heights as an example of why this was important. No local politician wanted to support the construction of social housing for the risk of offending voters, but he could. The issue remained in the background during Gardiner's time in office, but it would grow over time, especially as Metro projects became more controversial and opposition groups complained that popularly elected municipal officials were being overruled by a distant Metro government.
Gardiner decided to retire at the end of 1961. When he stepped down, Premier Leslie Frost declared that when Fred Gardiner took over metropolitan Toronto, the 13 municipalities were incapable of growing anymore. Now we have great development, great throughways, great things. He planned to go back to law, but found that age and general rustiness made that difficult. Instead, like many retired politicians, he sat on assorted boards of directors. However, he found this disappointing and described the problem in a letter to Leslie Frost. I think what made these activities soon lose their attraction was the fact that you had been used to being the boss of the province as I had been used to being the boss of Metro. We did not feel comfortable when simply being a member of another board where we did not have the same influence as we had in our previous activities. Instead, Gardiner indulged in the time-honored tradition of all old people, complaining about the youngins. I wish I was 15 years younger, he announced in an interview. Somebody's got to sit down and set some priorities. He was also critical of the anti-development ideas that emerged during the 60s and 70s. You can hear this attitude in a 1969 interview that he did for CBC.
I don't think that there is any specific size that a city should become and then stop. You won't be able to control it anyway. If they try to build an iron wall around metropolitan Toronto as it presently exists geographically, they'll find that in some fashion or another, it occupies a very important place in the province of Ontario, and industry and commerce and the people want to be where the action is, and you might as well go out and spit against the wind.
In 1967, he suffered a stroke that left him with slurred speech and memory problems. A failed hip replacement left him confined to a wheelchair. And by 1979, ill health had forced him to retire completely. When he died 4 years later, former Toronto Mayor Philip Gibbons said that Gardiner was the catalyst for it all, the transition that transformed Metro into one of the great cities of the world. Back when he was deputy mayor, Norm Kelly put a portrait of Gardiner in his staff office at City Hall. He said, "Big Daddy was a man of big ideas. It's ideas like that, entrepreneurial and far-sighted, that sustains a great city." Gardiner is an interesting figure to consider in hindsight. On one hand, many of his ideas about continuous development and growth, as well as his resistance to democratic accountability, seem incredibly dated today. At the same time, he made things happen. He put shovels in the ground, as he had promised to do. When you look at the shambles that the Eglinton Crosstown has become, you have to have some appreciation for the man who built some of the most important public works in Toronto. And just before we finish, I want to acknowledge Big Daddy by Timothy J. Colton, which was the primary source for this episode, and the only book I could find that focuses on Gardiner's life and legacy. When you consider how important he was, it's just another sign of how much a podcast like Muddy York is necessary. Where the academics and the journalists and the writers fail, Gray and I can succeed.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So, Adam, now that the episode's over, where can the good people find us?
Well, you can go to our Twitter feed, which is Toronto_history. You can go to our Facebook page, which is Muddy York History, all one word, or you can send it to us by email if you're old-fashioned. Our email is muddy_york@outlook.com, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time for the next episode. Say goodnight, Gray.
Say goodnight? What?
Yeah, when I say goodnight, Gray, you're supposed to say goodnight, Gray.
Oh. Okay, I got it now, I think.
Say goodnight, Gray.
Good night, Gray. Wait, no.
That's an old joke. You've heard of George Burns, right?
I know Mr. Burns from, like, The Simpsons.
Excellent.
He was actually the straight man for most of his career. He and his wife had a bit, and at the end he would say goodnight, Gracie.
Gracie, what about saying goodnight?
Oh, I should say not. I was so mad at her that I walked right out and left the store.
Gracie, I mean the people that are watching us.
Oh, well, I'm not mad at them. Good night, everybody.